Learn Japanese history.
We are your navigators, Taro and Hanako.
Hello.
So picture this, a nation at a massive crossroads, a real turning point.
That's where we're jumping in today for our deep dive. Japan had just been through this huge upheaval and was, well, right on the edge of some profound changes.
And we're going to unpack those very first steps, the initial actions and the guidance that was provided right after the war.
It's fascinating because Japan's situation was really quite different, wasn't it?
Absolutely. Compared to other defeated countries, I mean. The core government structure, domestically, it mostly stayed intact.
Except for Okinawa, of course.
Right, a major exception. But that basic continuity elsewhere really allowed for a specific kind of approach to all the reforms that were coming down the pike.
And when you talk about that guidance, we need to bring in the key players.
Definitely. The Allied powers, obviously.
But really, primarily the United States.
Yes, the U.S. took the lead. And General MacArthur, as SKIF's supreme commander for the Allied powers, he became this hugely central figure.
Setting up GHQ, the general headquarters, right there in Tokyo.
Now, there were other groups involved, like the Far Eastern Commission in Washington.
And the Allied Council for Japan in Tokyo, too.
But their actual influence on, day-to-day policy, it turned out to be, well, somewhat limited compared to GHQ.
Okay, so let's rewind to the absolute beginning of the occupation. The war ends.
And then, August 1945, General MacArthur arrives, lands at Atsugi Airfield.
Formally starting the whole Allied occupation process.
And it's critical to understand, even though other allies were there in, advisory roles.
It was essentially the U.S. running the show.
Pretty much, yeah. Which was, completely unprecedented for Japan. A foreign military occupation. They just hadn't happened before in their history.
How did that concentration of control affect things initially? The speed, the direction?
It arguably made things move faster, more decisive, perhaps.
Less negotiation needed between multiple equal powers.
Exactly. But it also meant, the reforms heavily reflected American ideas and priorities.
Makes sense.
And another really crucial thing was the strategy, indirect rule.
Ah, yes, working through the existing Japanese government.
Right, which was very pragmatic. It helped keep things orderly, gave people a familiar structure, even as all these new policies were coming in.
Okay, so let's get into those big initial aims. Demilitarization and democratization.
The core goals, really. Dismantle the military completely.
So Japan couldn't pose a threat again.
And fundamentally reshape society along democratic lines.
And the first post-war government, the Higashikuni cabinet, they struggled with this.
They did. They just couldn't really get a handle on these huge demands, and, well, they resigned pretty quickly.
And GHQ, from the start, they weren't messing around with criticism.
No, they took a very firm line. Any public critique of their policies was basically shut down. It set a clear tone.
Which leads us to that really key moment in October 45.
The 5 Great Reforms Directive, issued to the next cabinet, the Shidehara cabinet.
And these were massive.
Yeah.
Foundational.
Absolutely. A complete blueprint for change, almost. Emancipation of women.
Guaranteeing workers' rights to organize.
Liberalizing education. Abolishing oppressive systems.
And democratizing the economy. The sheer scope is just, wow.
It really was. Trying to dismantle the pillars of the pre-war system, patriarchy, suppressed labor, nationalist education, concentrated power, both political and economic. A radical overhaul very quickly.
And after that directive, we start seeing some big shifts, right? Socially, politically.
Yes, quite soon. One huge symbolic moment was the Emperor's Humanity Declaration.
January 1946, renouncing divine status.
Exactly. The idea that the Emperor was a living god gone, that had enormous ripples through the whole society.
Must have been mind-bending for many people, challenging such a long-held belief.
No doubt. And around the same time, GHQ issued the Purge Directive.
Right, removing former leaders deemed militarists or ultranationalists from public life.
And this wasn't just top politicians. It hit business, education, many sectors.
And speaking of education, that saw fundamental changes too.
Oh, big time. March 1947, you get the Basic Act on Education and the School Education Law.
Introducing coeducation and the 6334 school system.
Which is still the system today, basically.
And a whole new curriculum emphasis on pacifism and democracy.
Yeah. But it's important to remember the conditions back then. It wasn't easy.
No, I imagine not. Post-war devastation.
Exactly. Damaged schools, classes held outdoors sometimes.
Lack of books, material.
Students often had to do a lot of self-study, even, when it was raining. Really tough beginnings for that new system.
Let's shift to the economy. Two major areas stand out in the early restructuring.
land reform and breaking up the zaibatsu.
The agricultural land reform, that sounds incredibly significant for rural Japan.
It really was. The government basically forced absentee landlords to sell their land.
Compulsory purchase?
And then redistributed it cheaply to the tenant farmers who actually worked it.
Effectively dismantling that whole traditional landlord system.
Pretty much. There were limits, like resident landlords could keep about 1 cho.
A cho is about a hectare, right?
Roughly, yes. A bit more Hokkaido. But it gives you an idea of the scale. It fundamentally changed rural power structures.
And then the zaibatsu.
Right. These enormous family-controlled industrial and financial empires, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, the big names.
They held immense power before and during the war.
Absolutely. So the first step was freezing their assets.
And then came specific laws in 1947.
Yes, the Anti-Monopoly Act and the Excessive Economic Power Decentralization Act. The aim was to break them up.
To foster competition, prevent that kind of power concentration again.
That was the idea. Create a more democratic economy. Though, some argue their influence kind of reformed and persisted later on. It's complex.
Another major event from this time was the Tokyo Tribunal.
The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, where top leaders, Class A war criminals were tried.
By an international panel.
Representatives from 11 allied nations. Started in May 46, judgment in November 48.
And some received death sentences.
7 did, including former Prime Ministers Tojo and Hirota. Others got long prison terms.
How was it viewed? Justice or something else?
Both, really. Seen by many as necessary justice against aggressive war, but also criticized as victor's justice.
Wasn't there a dissenting opinion?
Yes. Justice Pal from India argued for acquittal for everyone.
Wow.
It highlights the controversy.
But notably, the emperor wasn't prosecuted.
No. That was a deliberate decision by the U.S. and GHQ.
Why?
They worried about the public reaction. The emperor was so central, prosecuting him might have caused chaos and undermined the entire occupation effort. So it was a pragmatic choice.
And there were other trials too, right? Not just the Class A ones.
Oh yes, many other military personnel were tried as BC-class war criminals in Japan and elsewhere.
It's crucial, though, to remember the backdrop to all this reform. Severe hardship.
Absolutely essential context. The economy was devastated. Production plummeted due to war damage and demilitarization.
Shortages of everything. Food, goods.
Critical shortages.
Yeah.
And runaway inflation. Just making ends meet was incredibly hard for ordinary people.
Did the government try to stop the inflation?
They tried. There was the Financial Emergency Measures Ordinance in February 46, freezing bank deposits, things like that.
Did it work?
Only partially. Inflation was still rampant. The Tokyo Retail Price Index, compared to pre-war, was just astronomical.
And the food situation?
Dire. The 45 harvest was catastrophic. Rationing was introduced, but it was a tiny amount, about 315 grams per person per day.
And even that wasn't always delivered.
Distribution delays were common. Tragically, people did die from malnutrition.
Plus, you had millions returning from overseas.
Yes, soldiers and civilians pouring back into a country that could barely support its existing population. No jobs, no housing. It was immense pressure.
And the orphans left behind in places like China. Just heartbreaking.
A really tragic aspect of the aftermath.
But amidst this hardship, new movements were stirring. Labor unions.
Yes, a huge surge. The trade union law of 1945 was key.
Guaranteeing the right to organize, bargain, strike.
Exactly. It unleashed a wave of activism.
Wasn't there a big strike planned?
The February 1st general strike in 47. Mostly public sector workers.
Oh, it happened.
GHQ stepped in and canceled it. They were worried about social unrest spiraling out of control.
But other labor laws followed.
Yes, the Labor Relations Adjustment Law in 46 and the Labor Standards Law in 47. They did bring significant improvements to working conditions over time.
And politically, parties were reforming, re-emerging.
A real blossoming in a way. You had the Liberal Party, tracing back to the pre-war Seiyukai.
The Progressive Party from the Minseido.
The Socialist Party, uniting various pre-war groups.
And the Communist Party was legal again.
Right, and then came that landmark election in 1946.
The first one where women could vote.
A huge milestone. The Liberal Party came out on top.
Leading to Yoshida Shigeru forming a cabinet. Party government was back after quite a gap.
And significantly, 39 women were elected to the Diet for the first time ever. Truly historic.
But perhaps the single most transformative piece of this whole period
Has to be the new constitution.
Absolutely central to everything.
GHQ wasn't happy with the initial Japanese attempts to just revise the old Meiji constitution.
They felt it didn't go far enough.
Not nearly far enough. So GHQ basically drafted its own version.
Incorporating those core principles. Popular sovereignty.
Power residing with the people, yes. And the renunciation of war, Article 9.
The Japanese government then took that draft, revised it.
And it passed through the Diet. Promulgated November 3rd, 1946, came into effect May 3rd, 1947.
Based on popular sovereignty, pacifism, and fundamental human rights.
The bedrock principles. And alongside it came the local autonomy law, elected governors and mayors. More power devolved.
And changes to the civil code, too.
Yes, abolishing the traditional I system, the household structure centered on the male head.
Giving women equal rights in law.
A massive social change, breaking down centuries of patriarchal structure.
So the first election under this new constitution was April 47.
And surprisingly, the Socialist Party became the largest party.
Riding that wave of labor activism, perhaps?
It seems likely. Which led to Katayama Tetsu forming a coalition cabinet in May 47.
Japan's first socialist prime minister.
Indeed. But those early coalition governments, they weren't very stable.
Internal conflicts. Scandals.
Yeah, disagreements within the Socialist Party, which was quite diverse, and things like the Showa Denko scandal hit the subsequent Ishida coalition. They didn't last long.
Until Yoshida Shigeru came back.
Right. His Democratic Liberal Party won a solid majority in the January 49 election. That ushered in a longer period of stability.
It's fascinating to see the numbers shift. 46, Liberals 140, Progressives 94, Socialists 92.
Then 47. Socialists jumped to 143, Liberals 154, Democrats, Progressives 121.
But by 49, Yoshida's party hits 264, Socialists down to 48. A big swing.
A very big swing. And it's worth remembering the early Socialist Party itself had quite a strong right wing internally as well.
So looking back at this initial phase, it was just immense change packed into a few short years.
Truly profound.
Yep.
A shift from military power to peace, building democratic foundations, starting economic and social reforms.
All under this unique condition of occupation.
It absolutely laid the groundwork for modern Japan.
And considering how much external guidance shaped this period, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How did that specific path influence Japan's later development, its place in the world?
And maybe think about which aspects of those early reforms, that foundational instruction, still resonate and shape Japanese society today. Something to ponder.